let's get into it.
Okay.
Shall we? I'm going to interview you really quick. So why did you love this book when you first read it? Well, first of all, how old were you when you first read this book?
I read it not that long ago, a few years ago, when Reese Witherspoon actually had it in her book club. And I read it and I loved it. And of course, I thought of you because, as soon as I saw the character's name, I was like, okay, Kaia has to read this book. And I loved the story and I loved the book. And I thought it's a good story for a young woman because it's really a coming of age story. Under unusual circumstances. Obviously, that Kaia's life is very different than most young women's. But I loved it, and I love the writing.
Yeah, the writing. It is very poetic, I think, the way that she writes. And what made you want me to... Because I remember when I first started reading, I had asked you for recommendations, and this was one of the first books that you had told me to read. So why this book?
Well, I just thought you would enjoy it, and I think that's the main thing to get people to love reading is finding stories that capture their imagination. And I feel like this story has everything. It has a mystery, it has a romance, it has, this beautiful writing. You talked about it being poetic. And one of the quotes that I wrote down in the very beginning was that autumn leaves don't fall, they fly. And when an author can give you that kind of picture, it just...
And in the middle of a page, she doesn't make a big deal out of it, so...
Right. And I think especially in this time, I just want not like total like candy escapism, but I want, if I'm going to read a book, we're all home and we're lucky we're together and, we live in Malibu and it's beautiful, but, it's a strange time for all of us to be alive and living and figuring out what this new normal looks like. So to have a book that transports me to, or I learn something, and I felt like this book did everything for me.
Yeah, it's like you're playing the movie in your mind as you're reading it, and it is rare actually to get a book that does that, so I was really grateful. Like, I felt like when I was reading this book, I was like seeing everything as it happened, which is a really incredible way of writing it.
Yeah, and I just thought also the relationship, well, and really it wasn't a relationship because her mother leaves when she's so young, but it's this longing, this primal kind of longing that not just a daughter, but a child has for their mother. And so much of that Kaia's life is about coming to terms with the fact that her mother left her.
Yeah, I can read the quote, which is, within all the worlds of biology, she searched for an explanation of why a mother would leave her offspring. And it's like, even though she was too young to understand, she still knew it wasn't right to not have your mom there.
Or that it was unnatural.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, completely. And I think, this like longing, I don't know what, there's just times like when I'm sad, my instinct is just like, I want my mom. And I think a lot of people feel that way. So it's kind of like her sort of trying to come to terms and also raise herself. There's like so many questions that I came to you with while I was growing up, and I still have questions for you every day about things. And I think that absence it weighs so heavy, especially on a young woman as she's, maturing.
Well, and she literally had no one. She didn't have eventually everyone in her family kind of peeled off. She didn't have teachers because when she went to school, she was made to feel like an outcast. And she was a young girl living by the Marsh herself. And this is one of the things that we talked about when we were reading it, is how the Marsh, that is actually a character in this book. Yeah. And it becomes her mother, her father, her lover, her friend. It absorbs her pain. And it doesn't make you want to go there and like go for 2 weeks? Like that's the beauty of the Marsh.
Yeah, it's that it can kind of relieve her temporarily, at least at these moments of feeling really alone, which is completely natural when your whole family is gone. And I think she's 9 when she's left on her own, and just the way that she sort of starts to educate herself. And also I think we should talk a bit about Tate, who is her sort of teacher.
Yes.
And like her first love. And I really liked the Tate character, except for when he ditches her when he goes to school. And so first, before we actually talk about Tate, I just want to ask, like, why do you think Tate ditched her?
Well, I think that as I was reading it and knowing that we were going to have this book club about it, I wrote down that as a question. But But then obviously he does explain it in the end, which is Tate is, she is of the marsh. She never fits in civilization.
Nor does she want to.
Eventually, because
Yeah.
she's been rejected again and again, and I wrote down that the hypocrisy of when she goes to town once, like, to get groceries, and she's dirty because she lives in a shack in the marsh, and the preacher's wife like pulls her children away from her and calls her dirty, and just, when you're rejected by something again and again,
especially
eventually
someone who you expect to hold you, like God loves all of his children, and
right.
you think that this is a big part of their community, that makes a lot of people feel included, and even they are rejecting her.
Right. So I think that her connection with Tate, really, it starts off as they both, he's had his loss as well. And
he lost his mother, right?
And sister, I think, in a
and
car
sister, yes. Yeah.
So they both have they both look to nature for comfort and really to make sense of the world. I mean, that's the thing, like and you referred to this in the beginning about the quote when she's looking to nature for looking any time where a mother in nature leaves her young, and there really isn't any, but that's how she figures stuff out. And I think that Tate has that same relationship with nature, and eventually he makes it his career and his job. So
so does she, really.
Right. But in the beginning, I think it's really innocent, that they're like kindred spirits just connecting in their love of nature.
And I think he also is really her only last connection with her family, because he was friends with her brother Jody, who she was the closest with, I think, and she eventually reconnects with. So I think her having that sort of last connection with her family, that last tie, and he offers to protect and take care of her, and he sort of has this nurturing instinct about him that maybe is because he lost his mom, and so he took on that sort of nurturing role in his family. But I feel like he plays a big role in teaching her and helping her grow up, and looking out for her. I think there's a quote about him having this brotherly protective instinct over her, but also loving her and wanting to be with her.
Well, I think it starts out, I mean, look, they've known each other since they were kids, so obviously it starts out as just this super innocent relationship and a love of fishing and, the marsh. And then he teaches her how to read, and he is protective of her because at that point their age difference seems much greater. If she's 15 and he's 19, that's a bigger age difference than when she's 20 and he's 24, right? As I always tell you.
I know.
So I think that their relationship unfolds in a really natural way, though. And I think he's very protective of her throughout the whole thing, except for when, as you started to say, he goes off to college. He promises he's going to come back as much as he can. And then the very first chance he has to come back, he doesn't see her.
And I think, I think part of it is because he cares so much about her, he couldn't say bye. He couldn't bring himself to break up with her, which I think is selfish, but it is also, I think that's when the maturing of men and women start to kind of show, because those 4 years suddenly seem like nothing. And it's almost like she's more emotionally mature because she's expecting at least a goodbye.
Right.
And he doesn't even give her the sort of explanation, as he just stops coming by, and she already has these abandonment issues. And that's why I think it hurt so much to read that part, was because she was already struggling with abandonment issues, and the one person who she thought was going to stick around didn't.
Right. It wasn't like he didn't know that she had those issues.
Yeah.
He knew and still didn't have the nerve to come back and say, because he had his own inner turmoil about how can I be with this woman that can't, how do I fit these pieces together? And he eventually evolves and comes to an understanding, but and a lot of them, they all had to go through a lot of pain to get there.
Yeah. And I think my favorite quote about Tate is sort of what his dad taught him. It says, his dad had told him many times that the definition of a real man is one who cries without shame, reads poetry with his heart, feels opera in his soul, and does what's necessary to defend a woman.
Right. And that's really who you want Tate to be. And he is most of the book, but then he has that,
I know.
he disappoints us, which also, is a great thing in books. It's harder in real life, but it's important. Like no one is 100% good or 100% bad. I mean, those characters tend to be very two-dimensional. And like, I think that's what made Tate, if Tate was just the perfect guy, we probably wouldn't even like him that much.
Because I think it makes him an unbelievable character,
Right.
and you don't get as attached. Like I think the fact that he learned from his mistakes, he worked to get forgiven. She did eventually forgive him, and that like worked. It makes you appreciate their love story a lot more, I think.
What did you think about her relationship with Chase?
Now Chase is interesting. I think it's difficult when you're learning. Basically, she had to learn everything the hard way because she didn't have anyone to teach her except the marsh. So, things like that, I think with Chase, she was sort of realized after Tate, like, I can't rely on anyone. So I'm not going to expect to rely on this person, but I'm actually getting attention and it feels good, and I'm just going to try it out. Now, I think Chase is a little bit different because I think he was a little bit pushier with her, which I didn't respond well to. And I remember her mom told her when she was younger, if you look tempting, men turn to predators. And now if that's an idea that's embedded in your head, I think it can be very toxic for young girls because it leads them to this idea of, oh, I might have been asking for it.
Right.
And I think Chase sort of was gaslighting her a little bit. And I did not.
How much, and I think we both underlined this quote, that she laughed for his sake, something she'd never done. Giving away another piece of herself just to have someone else. I mean, even though I think she knew Chase wasn't, and I don't think she ever really thought he was like the guy, but she was so lonely. And it was just this idea of what do you trade? And I think that was another quote.
Yeah.
How much do you trade to defeat lonesomoness? And how much, do you settle just because you don't want to be alone? Which is something as a mother, again, like I would counsel you, you don't need to do that. You'd rather be alone than in a bad relationship or lonely in a relationship, which happens.
Yeah, which I think she started, especially towards the end, feeling very neglected by him because, he's promising her all of these things, marriage and a life, and she even for a second thinks, oh, I can fit into this world. And then soon comes to realize it wasn't the reality and he wasn't planning to marry her. And, it's like she just constantly keeps getting let down by people. And I think that's why she starts getting super self-reliant because she realizes, and I think there was a quote about, when you rely on people, leaning on people, you just fall.
Yeah,
because she
on the ground. Yeah. The only thing that was constantly there for her was nature. It was the birds, Big Red, and even when she ends up in jail at the end, and again, we don't want to give it away for people who haven't read it, but this, like I said, this book has everything. It has courtroom suspense, and but when she's in jail and the cat comes, and cats are normally aloof and they're not they can kind of come and go as they want, but the cat just kind of looks around and jumps in her lap, and she says something about such an easy acceptance. And it's just a deep pause in a lifetime of longing. And I think she had this longing for connection, but obviously didn't have even a good example of what connection should look like. And the only place that she got, other than Jumpin and his wife Mabel, who were in a way her surrogate parents, but
they looked out for her
as much as they could.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. And I think she sort of like how they were treated in the town, they felt like outcasts, and they experienced racism, and she experienced a sort of prejudice against her as well for being an outsider. And so I think for her, finding people like Jumpin and Mabel that she could relate to and connect to, I think that was like they played a really important role in her life. Right. And I think some of the issues, and this really shows in her relationship with Chase, is because her example of a relationship when she was young was a really toxic and violent one between her mother and father. Her father would beat up her mother and even beat up her siblings and her. And I think, when that's your example of love And she was too young at the time to understand why her mom left her father. But she saw what was happening, so I think she tolerated this sort of bad behavior from Chase because that was her example of love. But when I think she reached the breaking point, like her mother did when she left, she says she understands finally why her mom left her dad.
Yes, like living through that herself gave her compassion and empathy for her mom. And, you know, she only had examples of human beings letting her down and leaving her and disappointing her. And normally it was because they left. But then when Jumpin dies, it's the first time she experiences loss without being left. I mean, he just passed. So she had, and I think that also was another layer of her healing and toward forgiving her mom and just understanding that not all loss is like someone choosing to leave you.
And that, I think it was, she was finally old enough because, you know, it took her a long time to process people leaving her and why. Yes. The sort of idea of why, and I think when you're young and this keeps happening, you can start to blame yourself and think, well, it must be me. What's the one common denominator? And I think by the time Jumpin passes, she realizes that it's not her fault, and she can move on from it and she can grieve. And I think it allowed her to also grieve the people that walked away from her in the past, because by the time she found out her mom had died, it was 2 years after she had died and she had already been gone for so long that she couldn't believe. But it was like every time she walked out of her house, she looked for her mom. And I think that was what was heartbreaking for me, was kind of feeling throughout the whole book this undertone of her just waiting for her mom to come back.
Yeah, and just the way she, any little scrap or remnant of her mother, like even when she finally has money and can fix up her shack, that she still wants the kitchen and the table, like certain things that remind her of her mother, or the food that she cooks, the hush puppies or whatever, how that's how she holds on to her mom through memories. And I think that that's really true even for a lot of us. I mean, you know, some of our traditions that we do at Christmas or whatever, it's because my grandmother used to make that or my mother used to make that. And those things are really, like, I think beautiful. I mean, some of the food that my mom used to make, I don't even like anymore, but I'll still make it because it reminds me of being a kid and that feeling of being a kid with the love of a mother. And I think that, you know, that she was yearning for that, and the way she found to connect it were through those little things.
Yeah, I think her, especially cooking, came a lot from her mom. And I just think, you know, even when I started being more independent and like cooking for myself and doing all that stuff, like I was constantly trying to find ways to bring you back into it, because you do subconsciously pick up on so many things that even when I talk to people, they say, you know, you have the same mannerisms as your mom. And I don't even notice it, but I think subconsciously, like, we look to our mothers for so much. And, you know, even though she was, I think, 6 when her mom left, she still carried her throughout her entire life.
Yes, and as a role model. I think what's interesting, and this is not really about the book, but since we're talking about mother-daughter relationships and just in general, like, you are at that age where, you know, you're totally pretty much launched, you're very independent, but then yesterday you broke your wrist, you have a cast, and all of a sudden you need help doing everything.
I know, and I feel a bit like Kaia, because I've always like really prided myself on being very independent and doing everything by myself. And to have to ask for help is a new thing for me.
But I also think that being vulnerable in that way, and I think that's where Kaia had trouble with Tate, right? Because she had trouble asking or saying what she wanted, which is a theme in some of the other books, like Normal People, that you've read too, right? Where people are afraid to say what they want. But, you know, Kaia eventually gets there. And like for you today, just asking me to help you like chop up a cucumber because you can't do it.
Or like tie my dress for me.
Right, but being able to, like, I think that's part of maturity, is understanding that vulnerability and asking people for help does not mean weakness. And
I know how to better myself.
There's a trust there that, you know, that is a beautiful balance about relationships.
Yeah.
Oh.
I think being able to let people in and, you know, understand that not every bad experience dictates the rest of your life.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why Kaia was so strong at the end, because she really did, in so many ways, the world was against her, and proved to her over and over again, you know, stay isolated, because the only thing that you're going to be able to rely on, the only thing that's going to catch you is the nature and the ground beneath you. And for
Yes.
her to be able to overcome that, you know, deep rooted trauma of her family leaving her, of people being against her, of being bullied out of school, and being able to finally like trust someone and be vulnerable and open with someone, and end up with someone, that is a big, I think, nature versus nurture, because it shows that you can overcome.
And that's why I suggested this book to you, and I'm glad you read it, and I'm glad you got the message from it, because it's like a very, you know, empowered in the end. You know, she's always independent, but just being independent isn't everything, right? Like it's this balance between being independent, but also being vulnerable. And then when she finally gets there and learns to accept love, then she's a whole person. She's a whole person.